How's it going? Oh my gosh, this is like super awkward. I'm not built for this. Meh. All right, how's everybody doing this afternoon? Got that food coma? Thank you, sir. That is the energy I like to hear. God, this is like freaking me out. Can I just take this?
Yeah.
Boom, there we go. Okay. All right, so kind of want to get a feel for the room. How many of y'all are building Angular, any kind of Angular apps? Anybody? Okay, I got a couple hands. It's okay to raise your hand on this question. How many of you are writing AngularJS apps? Nobody. Oh man, you are some of the chosen, the precious few. But don't worry, hopefully you will still get something out of this talk. I do a lot of conference speaking all over the world, and I've recently started to find out how many people are still running AngularJS applications, which just blows my mind. But then I forget what it's like to be in corporatopia and dealing with just legacy code bases. And so I wanted to make sure that we're making sure that everybody is getting good content. But I'm going to cover a couple things in here today, including a little intro to web components. So hopefully you'll learn something regardless of what tech stack you're rocking. And because we're about midway through the day, I figured we might need a little dev inspo for thinking about everything we're learning and not feeling bad, because it's okay, as long as we keep trying, we'll get it figured out. So to whoever needs to hear this, the concept you're currently struggling to learn, stick with it, because it's all going to start to make sense very soon, especially if you are still learning RxJS. You'll get there, I promise, it's gonna be okay. And if you click into this tweet, there's something quite derogatory in the next thing, and it's hilarious. But Miranda hopefully will help you stay away from that with avoiding imposter syndrome. A little bit about me, my name is Jennifer Wadella. Does this keep cutting in and out? Is that just me? Okay.
We have another one if we want to swap.
Can I swap?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, while we get that figured out, because it's like freaking me out. JavaScript developer at Bitovi. I lead all their Angular consulting. I am a legacy code sympathizer, community organizer, and I brew kombucha on the side. So let's switch up our mics. What? But cats? Well, I have like 4 of those too, so yes. I have 4 cats, I have a dog, I have 2 chinchillas. I can't even tell you how many plants I have. I have a bunch of squirrels I want to murder for eating my tomatoes. All right, now that we got our mics handled. All right, so let's talk about the problem going on today. We're going to upgrade our AngularJS app someday, because we've all been in those discussions with business where they're like, hey, gonna get this someday, but we really can't dedicate the time for it right now. Or maybe you're in a situation where business is like, well, why did we spend all this money writing this app in this one technology you just have to have? And you're like, well, technology changes, that's the way the world works. Anyway, a lot of us have been there before, and a lot of us understand the pain, because you struggle with this idea of how do we keep building features. Is this cutting out too? All right, we'll just have to deal with it, because I don't think I can scream all the way to the back, and that's bad for accessibility anyway. But how do we keep building features while we are preparing for an upgrade? It's kind of just like frustrating emotionally to like understand that you're writing this one technology when someday you might have to rewrite the whole thing, and it kind of like kills your motivation to do anything in this world. So how do we build modern apps when this is the case? How do we keep our skills updated as a developer? And especially as JavaScript developers, a lot of us have this fear all the time where if you're not on the latest tech stack and heaven forbid your startup goes under, or you need to find a new job, nobody's going to take you unless you have production experience and whatever the fancy new tech is. And so when you're maintaining legacy code as a developer, this is kind of that constant fear, right? Like, how do I make sure that I am on top of latest trends while making sure that I'm getting features pushed out in this current technology? Or maybe you're in the boat of, I just got this AngularJS app dropped in my lap. I write React, or I write modern Angular. I've never written AngularJS in my life. What the hell is going on? What do I do? I Google search and everything is like from 2015 or earlier. How do I know what's going on? So the good thing is you can take a lot of advantage of modern techniques that we're using primarily in Angular development, but you've started to see RxJS really take hold across a variety of different frameworks. So how do you take advantage of those modern techniques today? Especially when you're supporting something that maybe wasn't built on top of these tools or built with these tools in mind. Okay, so goals for this talk that we're going to go through today. I want to give you a roadmap of how you could approach modernizing an AngularJS app. I want to give you a crash course on some modern concepts that you may have tuned out on previously, because we've all been there where you're like, oh, well, I can't do this at my job now. My ears are just going to turn off. I'm going to pop open Twitter or TikTok. Is anybody into TikTok yet? Yeah, okay. I'm like, I've reached that adulthood status where I like post no content, but I just like consume it all and just laugh hysterically and just like stuff. Yeah, I've become my mother on Facebook. It's terrifying. Okay, so things you might have tuned out on before, we'll kind of cover those. I also want to give you resources to help advocate for modernizing your app. Writing code is a big part of our jobs, but another big part of our jobs is being able to advocate for the resources and the processes and the systems that we want to use. And so I want to make sure that you can walk out of here today and say, hey, I like this approach. I think this is why we can take it. I think this is why it will add value to our business and why it would be good for our team. And then give you an example repository with some common scenarios you can refer to. All right, so let's look at a roadmap and what that could be for upgrading an AngularJS application. The first thing we need to think about doing is modularizing our app. And this is kind of funny because if you're writing modern web, you're like, oh, duh. But then if you go back and look at the way a lot of AngularJS apps were written, it was kind of like the wild, wild west. There wasn't a lot of framework or styling outside of just like your app.module and then dumping components everywhere. And you might have had one big file. You might have had like 20, 30, 40 files that you were dumping in an index.html page that was maybe being served inside of like some sort of .NET project. All sorts of insane scenarios that could have happened. So how do we take the state of whatever the application might be in and then look at modularizing it so then we can begin to apply some newer concepts to it? We're going to look at how we can either update or create a build process to compile TypeScript files. We want to take advantage of TypeScript as a tool, and so part of that is making sure that as we're creating code, we're able to compile it into browser-readable JavaScript. We want to convert our core app structure files to TypeScript. The cool thing about doing a lot of these upgrade approaches and techniques, and especially with TypeScript, is just because you choose TypeScript and choose to start using it does not mean that every file needs to be in TypeScript right away. It all compiles to JavaScript at the end of the day, so it'll play really nicely so you can kind of go bit by bit and figure things out. We're going to look at taking advantage of RxJS where it makes sense. RxJS is a great tool for reactive programming. You do not need to put it everywhere, so use with pragmatic caution. And then we want to talk about building new features using Angular elements, which are essentially wrapped web components. So this is kind of our roadmap that we could take. If today we know we have an AngularJS app, some sort of legacy code base, we might update it someday, or maybe we're never going to update it and we just want to like not hate our lives while we're writing code on a daily basis. This is an approach you can take. Okay, so let's talk about modularizing our app. And if you were not an AngularJS developer in my area, you might not have been aware of the AngularJS style guide. And on the 10th day, it was delivered to us by the god John Papa as a way to guide our AngularJS development. So I talk about AngularJS being just like the wild, wild west, not a lot of structure. And so John Papa created the style guide that came out with a lot of really, really great patterns about how we could begin organizing our code in a way that makes sense, in a way that is modularized, in a way that is much more readable. And so this is a huge style guide with a lot of content. No, that's decently sized. Okay, it's very tiny on my screen. But just a bunch of different kind of big concepts, different ways to approach how you should name things, how you should structure your application, all sorts of things. So a lot of really great information in here. And it does surprise me again how many people maintaining AngularJS apps have never heard of the style guide, because when I was writing AngularJS and found this, I was like, oh, it's amazing. All right. So the key concepts out of this style guide that I would encourage teams to focus on, because obviously that style guide is very, very robust. The first thing, practicing single responsibility. And so this largely relates to encapsulating your code, your components in one file. So essentially one component per file, one service per file, whatever Angular feature that you're using, having those inside of singular files, because a lot of tutorials that you saw in AngularJS, you would start with a module, it might have some controllers applied to it, and then it's just like, 60,000 lines of code later, you've got all that in one file. It's a pain in the butt for version control, figuring out where things are. So starting to pull apart your application and make sure that components and services and directives and filters are in their own file. The next part of that is using named functions. When we start to glue our applications back together, we're going to be creating some sort of component on the side of our app module. And so instead of doing a pattern where you basically have an anonymously named or an anonymous function in there, starting to import our files and export them as declared function names. So somebody reading the code can really understand, oh, okay, this is my Queens controller. I'm going to assume that it's for my Queens component and handle all that logic. And then finally, using the right controller view as VM syntax. And so if you know anything about AngularJS, you know we kind of got into a bad habit of binding everything on $scope and putting that everywhere, and it can be very, very hard to read. And so this VM syntax was started, VM meaning view model, and so we use that as what our controller should be, bind everything, bind all our properties to that, and it's a lot cleaner and a lot more readable. Okay. Some of these things you have to do simultaneously when looking at your app. So we're going to be needing to modularize our files and start writing them in a certain way, but at the same time, we need to make sure that our build process is going to be able to handle those files. So we've got three main tools that are kind of being used right now. Grunt is, I feel like, the oldest as far as adoption of these three. So this was a task runner. Then we got Gulp that took a different way to approaching how it would handle copying and concatenating and bundling files that ended up being a lot faster. And then today, a lot of us might be using Webpack. This is what Angular, and again, if you're not familiar with Angular, we've got AngularJS, which refers to everything before Angular 2. And then Angular 2 through we're on version 8 right now is just considered Angular. But so the Angular CLI, which does a lot of our application spin up and everything, all of that is built on Webpack. Our build process is built on Webpack. You never think about it. But when you're developing AngularJS applications, you don't have this build system under the hood for you available and ready to use. So we can take a couple different approaches, and I've seen all of these, which is why I want to cover them. But so if you are already using Grunt, which might be your scenario, that's what you're using to compile files, all you're going to need to do is add some sort of TypeScript compilation to your process. So you might have a config file, and when it comes to setting up your TypeScript, at this first point in time, you might have one main TypeScript file that you've started to bundle your app module logic with, and we'll talk about this in the next step, because these are two of those things that you have to kind of do simultaneously. So you have kind of an entry point, and then you have a destination if you're writing to maybe like a public or a distro where you're serving your production-ready code for. You want to make sure that you're exporting those files there, and then can declare a couple different options. So that's what taking your current Grunt configuration and adding TypeScript to it so we can start writing in TypeScript files would look like. The next one we have, and this is one that I used for many, many years before switching to Webpack, is Gulp. It's going to be a lot faster runtime-wise, which is why a lot of the Grunt community jumped over to the Gulp. But if you're already running that in your process, you're going to want to go ahead and install your TypeScript compiler. And so you might have a certain task that maybe is going to compile all your TypeScript files. And so you will go and look for your TypeScript files, do whatever output. So again, whether you're putting it in like some sort of a build or public or dist folder, making sure that all the files end up getting dumped there. And finally, we have Webpack. And so Webpack is a little bit more config-based and does a lot of really great stuff for us. So you might have a sample that looks like this. We've got a basic entry point. So this is going to be my index.ts file. This is where I'm going to be importing all my base level JavaScript. So obviously I'm going to need my Angular library. I think AngularJS was still dependent on jQuery, so I'm going to have to pull that in. And any subsequent Angular modules I need, like Angular Router or Angular Animate. I'm going to import all that in that main file, and I'm going to have my app module definition there, and that's going to be kind of like my entry point into the application. One of the great things that Webpack offers us is it'll do that hashing, so it'll generate a dynamic name, and so we don't have to worry about caching issues because it's constantly serving a new hash map for that. So we can go ahead and output our compiled file into a bundle file. Webpack also allows us to run a dev server, and so this can be really, really helpful for getting your configuration set up. And then finally for Webpack, what we need to do is, you can do this a couple different ways, but the way I prefer is to just have my basic index.html file that might have that component selector that I'm going to use. But I don't necessarily want to have to keep updating whatever my compiled JavaScript is, right? And so this will actually dynamically inject that tag for you, so you don't have to worry about it using your base template or your base index.html file as a template. So it'll take that template, it'll dump all the scripts that you're compiling into that template into your dist directory or wherever you're serving your code from. We have to deal with a couple different loaders in Webpack. We're going to need our HTML loader that is going to handle that HTML file, as well as a TypeScript loader. And so loaders are how Webpack basically assesses files and then compiles them down to what they need to be. So if you've got less or SAS or whatever, you're using similar loaders to deal with that. So the reason I like working with Webpack is it's built to compile things, and we need to compile our TypeScript files if we want to modernize our AngularJS app. We can automatically inject those compiled bundle files into our entry file, and we can serve them. So that's a really convenient setup. There are some other really nice things that you can do with Webpack. You can do more advanced bundling. So if you're doing lazy loading, meaning you have some sort of app structure set up, you don't want to load certain parts of the application until a user is navigated to that path inside the app and you know that they're going to be using that functionality. We can do all sorts of different builds between development, test, and production code. And so having only code that we test against, development code, maybe having code that isn't minified so we can debug it easier, and production code is where we've fully minified everything and have it nice and small and ready to serve. I also have no power in this thing. That's quite concerning. Sorry, I'm like watching my power bar going, oh, this could be an adventure. And now I killed it. Come back to me. Well, that was interesting. Okay. Okay, so step one and step two are kind of combined here. So we're talking about using some sort of build process tool if you do not have one. If you do have one, starting to integrate some sort of TypeScript compilation process into that build tool. The next step is getting your app to a point that maybe you have a single point of entry instead of dumping like 20 different files on the page. Yeah, I only have one USB-C. Womp womp. Tiny MacBook. Nope. Only one. All right, we'll see how much power I have to get through this presentation. And yes, we'll just watch Jordan like sweat profusely as she like watches the battery indicator on my laptop. It'll be great. All right, so talking about converting our core app structure files to TypeScript. First, let's do a quick TypeScript crash course because I feel like developers fall in like one of two camps. They are somebody coming from JavaScript, from a struggling type language, that are like, yes, TypeScript, this is what I've been waiting for. And then you've got JavaScript developers who are like, you can't tell me what to do. I don't care if my variable is a string, and then it's a number, and then it's a null, and it's a boolean. That's what makes JavaScript fun, right? And then you never read anything about TypeScript, and then you just fight the compiler, and you're like, stop yelling at me. So, those of you in here, you know who you are. All right, so TypeScript crash course, we have types which determine what type a variable should be, and I'm cutting in and out again. We have classes, which are special functions that help us abstract code. If you're coming from a more object-oriented programming background, this will feel like home to you. It'll be nice and cushy and safe, and JavaScript developers, again, are like, what? We've got interfaces, which are a way to describe programmatic entities. And then we've got generics, which are a way to reuse code for different types. And then the other great thing we have with TypeScript is a lot of the features that ES6 brought us if you are not using it in your setup already. So when we talk about types, it's declaring what kind of type a variable should be. I'm sure if you've written JavaScript ever, you've run into that situation where you are trying to do something because you think something is a number and really it's a string, and you're having to throw parse ints, and then you're getting errors that, you know, this method cannot be applied to this variable, and you're like, what is happening in my life? So cool thing about TypeScript, it allows us to define those types and then TypeScript is going to be compiling our code, and that means whatever tool you've used, whether it's Grunt, whether it's Gulp, whether it's Webpack, whether it's just doing straight CLI TypeScript compilation, you're going to get errors with your code at compilation time versus runtime. And so the cool thing is we're catching errors earlier. We're not having to wait through a build process to testing in a browser and then realizing that we did something incorrectly. So defining these types can help us better kind of determine what our variables should be. And this is also kind of a way to document your code. And so if I'm, somebody coming into a new code base and I see that, I have this function and realizing that I should pass a string versus an int, which happens a lot with, dealing with service calls and making HTTP requests based on ID, that can be really, really helpful. So self-documentation is great. Next we have classes, and it's worth knowing that you can use JavaScript's prototype method to create classes, but this is a more familiar class syntax for those of you who are aware. So a basic class, you can have members on it. Like on this class, I have a member greeting. Any member is going to be public by default, so you can use a public or a private specifier based on what your needs are. You have some sort of constructor, so when you're creating a new instance of this class, you can pass in a number of properties, and then you can have functions, all sorts of fun things on your class. This is heavily utilized in Angular development, and so I like recommending that AngularJS developers start moving towards using classes if they're using TypeScript inside of their applications, because if they're coming from the wild, wild west of JavaScript and this is a new concept for them, it's a good way to start to get on board, and it's going to feel a lot more familiar once you make that eventual transition into Angular. So you can begin to write everything in classes and use them accordingly. I also like to call out this little shorthand that I use a lot that sometimes throws people. If you use either a public or a private modifier in your constructor function, that will automatically set that property as a member on your class. And so that's just a nice little shorthand. You will see that a lot in Angular syntax. So worth pointing out if you were unfamiliar. Okay, we have interfaces, which are like my favorite part of TypeScript. And again, coming from JavaScript, never doing strongly typed languages, I'm like, oh, like interfaces. I can like write and describe things and document things and people can know what's going on. It's magic. Things I get way too excited about, interfaces and plants and kombucha. Hell yeah, thank you. So in here I have some sort of function, and this function is going to take a parameter of queen, and I want to make sure that that is a type of queen or an interface of queen. And so a queen is going to have two properties on it. It's going to have a name quote, and it's going to have a name member and a quote member. Because I'm returning this certain line, that I need both properties on that member. And so that way, when I'm writing this function, and if I try and pass in an object that does not have these properties that I'm expecting, I'm going to catch it right there, instead of letting this go all the way through the browser and then getting some sort of error like, quote is undefined or something like that. My demo code is using the drag race API, by the way. Yes, queen. Yeah, so if you don't know what that is, go educate yourself. Drag race is amazing. Yeah, so there will be random. Bianca Del Rio is my favorite queen, so I have mostly her in my demos.
Really?
Of course, she's the comic insult queen. She's very catty.
Skinny legend.
We're gonna go off the rails super quickly here. All right, okay, moving on. So we talked about interfaces. One of the other great things that we use a lot of times with interfaces are something called generics. And I like to point this out because if you're new to TypeScript, it's something really hard to Google for unless you know the name of it. So a generic is in between these carets, and a generic is basically saying, hey, I want you to tell me what type you're expecting for use in this function. And so the whole point of TypeScript, right, is getting that type checking and making sure that we're passing in the right type that we're going to be dealing with. And so if you are writing code in a way that you can only specify like a type, like let's say I only want to deal with a type of number, but what if I want to take that function and also use it for a type of string? That's a lot of duplicate code. So generics are really great. They allow us to pass in types essentially as a variable and use them wherever. So this is an example of what a service would look like in Angular, where I just want to make an HTTP request to hit some sort of endpoint. And then here I'm defining what that response should look like. And I'll talk about this in a minute, but this is a type of, or an Angular type of iHTTP response, and it's asking me what that response type should be. So we can use generics to really abstract our code and make it more readable and more maintainable. And then ES6 Fun, so there are a ton of features, but the two that I feel like you're going to come across most often are going to be the template literals. And so this is where we use these little backticks, and instead of doing the parsing where you'd have like your traditional string and you'd put a plus sign and then you'd put your variable and then you'd continue on with your string, you can use template literals with this backtick and pass in a variable inside of the $sign curly braces. So you'll see those a lot throughout. If you haven't been able to use them, once you start using TypeScript, you will be able to. The sun will smile upon you. Everything will be great. And we also have fat arrow functions, which somebody was like, do you really call those fat arrow functions? And I don't know if there's a better name or if there's anything more widely used than fat arrow functions. Anyway, we have them available to us in TypeScript. Say?
Dummy thick.
Really? Oh. Oh, okay. Good times, good times. I like the front row peanut gallery. It's fun for a speaker to have people to like riff with. Okay, so if you're not a super JavaScripty person, this code might look fine to you, and you might expect this console log output Bianca yawned. But we are actually not encapsulating the this of the class, and so this is going to log undefined. So we've got a basic function called, you'd be familiar with that syntax. The cool thing is when we use our fat arrow to create our functions instead, that's going to bind the scope of this to what we want it to be. And so that is something nice that you are able to take advantage of with TypeScript. Okay. All right. So now that we've gone through our TypeScript crash course, we all TypeScript pros now, right? You're like, no, Jennifer, why are you doing this to me? Okay. Let's get back to our AngularJS app conversion. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to install Angular types. And so these are going to give us largely just interfaces of ways we're supposed to write Angular code in members or properties that might be required. One thing I didn't mention with interfaces, if you're not familiar, is if you define an interface, all of those functions or members on them are required unless you denote that they're optional with a question mark at the end. So if you're ever using interfaces and you're trying to maybe create a class that's implementing an interface, you're going to get a TypeScript error until you have made sure that you have all those members or methods or whatever defined by that interface defined inside your class. Okay. So we're going to get our Angular types. We'll have our interfaces available for everything we can need. The next thing we need to worry about is making our HTML templates importable. So we are going to be importing and exporting a lot of different things between files to modularize our application. A lot of times templates can get really, really messy, and so you might have those in their own HTML file, which you then inject into your application. So we want to be able to set up to handle this from a TypeScript standpoint. So you can create what's called a TypeScript declaration file where you're just saying, hey, any sort of file that ends in .html, I'm going to just assume that's a module according to TypeScript and let you import it. And I will tweet a link to these slides afterwards, so any links that you see, you'll be able to get. So you might see something that looks like this, where we've got our base Angular module called ngQueen app, and then we might have a component. And so this is what I was talking about with those kind of unnamed functions where it just like gets really hard to read really, really quickly. But this is a setup that you might have seen. We have this inline template that's super gross with all its plus concatenations. We've got a controller which has a queens member on it, and we've got some information. So this is basically an array of drag queens that I would like to display inside of my component. So this is code that you might stumble across in an AngularJS application. The first thing we want to do is we want to start refactoring this. And so we want to start with our controller that we're going to have. And so in here, we're going to have one parameter, which is queen service. This is a service that's going to make all my API calls. And so this is how we handle dependency injection when you start to move to this method, as we can call the inject method and give it an array of whatever things we need to import into it. We're going to bind this to be the variable VM, and so we're going to use that in our template. So when I talked about that controller as VM, is this one better? Is this one better? A or B?
I think that one, the one that was cutting out, we're trying to switch out.
Oh, they both were cutting out.
Both were cutting out? Okay, well, let's try that one and see if that works out better.
Okay. Is it better yet? Is it better yet?
Yeah, it's
Is it better yet?
Way better. Oh, man.
Really? It's like the optometrist, right? Where they're like A or B, and you're like, oh, I don't know. And then, oh, okay. Anybody else have that anxiety? Yeah. Okay.
Are you impostering your imposter song yourself?
Yes. Hashtag on brand, yes. Okay, all right, so we have bound this to our variable VM, and so in our controller we will, or excuse me, in our template, we will refer to everything in this view model on that property. And then I'm just making a call to my queen service. I've got this method getQueens that is basically going to make an HTTP request and return to me a list of drag queens, and then I am setting vm.queens to be the response of that request. Then I'm creating an object here, and it's kind of, with frameworks, if you don't like remember that it's just JavaScript, which is, you know, just functions, it can be kind of confusing, but really all we're doing here is we're creating an object that's going to have our controller, it's going to have our controller as syntax, which we've defined as VM, and then whatever template that we want. So we're gonna kind of bundle that all together and we're going to export that. So then that was what we'll be able to reference to in our app module. So we've got all that going on, and then we can go ahead and export this object, and then we are ready to go ahead and import that into our app module. And so we've got this nice separate file that's taken away, and we can just use that wherever we want. So here was our app module before, as I switch around a lot. No, where'd it go? Oh, there we go. Okay, so we're starting to get all this code already here. With the single responsibility rule, kind of the best practice is to just define your app.module in your main file and then inject your components on that. And so instead of having all this code inline, we can just start importing the code from different files, and we end up with a much cleaner file here. So we're going ahead and we're instantiating our model, and then we are creating this Queens component on it, and we've just imported the contents of that other TypeScript file in to be our component. So a lot cleaner, a lot more readable, a lot more maintainable. Yay us. Gold star, where's my raise? Okay. The next step, and you do not have to do this, but you can start refactoring your code even further to use classes and take a more object-oriented approach to writing your AngularJS code. So here's an example where I have my controller again, but in this case, I am implementing this iComponent controller interface, and that's going to kind of define what this controller should look like. That's also going to give me some lifecycle methods like onInit, which is going to be called when our component is generated and exists in the DOM. But here you can see I've got my constructor syntax where I'm able to access my service. I haven't written any interfaces for my service, so I'm doing a naughty and I'm using the type of any, which just lets me behave like I'm writing JavaScript with no types. Rules be damned. And then I can go ahead and create a component class for my component where I was creating that object before where I was binding all these things. We can take this approach instead to make sure that we're binding everything that we need because we're implementing our iComponents interface. And then export that whole component, and then we will use that in the exact same way that we saw in our app module. So just different way to start writing more object-oriented code. So if you have maybe a component that is going to be working for a view, and you've got a very similar view with throughout many places in your application, you can begin to use classes to build on other classes and really streamline that code. All right, we feeling excited about upgrading? Yeah, upgrading this AngularJS app that none of you are writing right now. Just kidding. Okay. All right, let's talk about RxJS. Is anybody using RxJS? Okay, a couple hands. Is anybody like trying to use RxJS? And did you see that tweet where it's like the guy and there's like the fire like hose spitting out of the ground and he jumps on top of it, gets like skyrocketed and was like, that's what using RxJS is like? Yeah, it's how it feels. Okay, so I'll give you all a crash course for those who aren't using it, and then you might walk away and be like, "Oh, I like this. I'm getting down on this." But for our AngularJS applications, we want to talk about using RxJS where it makes sense. So that might mean managing forms. In Angular, we have reactive forms, which is a really powerful, awesome API that makes form handling a lot easier, using services, and possibly routing. So let's give you a reactive programming crash course real quick, because if you're like reactive programming, what is that? What are you crazy JavaScript people doing now? We have two types of programming that you might be familiar with. We've got declarative programming and we've got imperative programming. And so imperative is when an event occurs, we might run some code and that'll change the state of the program. So maybe I click a button, I've got some sort of order application and I want to create a new order. And so I've got an order object, I click a button, that sets a property on my order object that is going to be new order, and then I go along my way doing some code. The problem is it's not very traceable. Like we have all this random stuff happening. It can be really hard to follow and figure out where events and sequences happened. So there's a more declarative style of program, which is where we specify how values should be generated. And so we might start with our object or our order value, and then we want to derive properties or states or whatever of that object from other pieces of our application. So we kind of have one source of truth that we can start at and then kind of like trace the timeline backward to figure out what's going on. And so reactive programming is a declarative style of programming that is concerned with data streams and propagation of change. This is really important to us in JavaScript as front-end developers because a lot of what we're dealing with most of the time is interaction from a user, which could change in a variety of different ways, as well as getting responses back from APIs and all sorts of things. So how do we cognitively take all this information, weave it together in a way that is more readable and more declarative? So RxJS is a reactive programming JavaScript library that we have all come to know and love or cry over at night, at least until you get familiar with it. So a couple base concepts for reactive programming and working with RxJS. Main thing is we have observables, and these are lazy push collections of multiple values over time. So if I've got this observable created here, basically it's going to one after the other emit a value of 1, 2, and 3. I can subscribe to my observable. You have to subscribe to an observable to get the values from it. It's kind of like signing up for a newsletter. You won't get the information until you sign up for it. It's going to go ahead and it's going to log out those values as it gets them in order once we subscribe to our observable. We have subjects. So these are special types of observables that can be multicasted to multiple observers, and we can publish and subscribe to them. So they can sit there and emit values, or we can give them values as well. The problem is each of these subscriptions is going to get different values. And then if you subscribe after values have already been emitted, you won't get those most recent values. So one of the things we end up using a lot is something called a behavior subject. It's like a subject, but it'll re-emit the last emitted value or a default value if it's set. And finally, we have operators, and so these are methods to call in observables to transform them. It's worth knowing that they only ever return new observables. You're not modifying the observables underneath. And some people have called this it's like Lodash, which kind of makes sense, but then if you go just with that mindset, you might end up confusing yourself. But basically ways to manipulate and deal with our observables or our streams of data that we're working with. Okay, so back to Angular. In Angular, Angular is built on RxJS, and so we have a lot of really great built-in functionality available to us. One of the really cool things in Angular is we have something called an async pipe. And it's a pipe we can put in that is basically inside of our HTML, it's going to create a subscription to an observable. It's also going to tear down that observable when the destroy method is called. And so instead of having to worry about memory leaks and subscribing to and unsubscribing from our observables, the async pipe handles that all for us. And once you start using it, you're like having to write like .subscribe just seems blasphemous. But somebody has actually written in async pipe for AngularJS, so we can go ahead and install and use that. And it's going to look something like this, where if you remember, I made a call to get my list of drag queens, and maybe I want to iterate through that list, and I want to display different things. Like I want to display the queen's name and the queen's quote. So here, this is how you iterate through something in AngularJS. I'm going to, it's essentially a for loop. So I've got my queen iterary here, and then here is my VM.displayedQueen as an observable. You'll see that $ syntax at the end because that's just something we do to say, hey, person new to reading my code, this is an observable, be prepared. And then we can use this pipe async function, and that's going to automatically create this subscription to it. It's worth knowing that, so this is a port over, and I will show you this in another code sample, but this will just create the subscription, but we can also pass in a colon this, and it's going to bind that to the scope, and so that means when that scope is destroyed, this will be torn down. So if you want that unsubscribe functionality, you need to bind this to it. Okay. So to create an observable, I have a queen service, which is making a call to an API to return a list of queens, and that is returning an observable. So I'm going to go ahead and call that method, and that's going to be an observable waiting for me to do something with it. So I'm going to set that to this.displayedQueens. And then the next thing I want to do, and I'm going to show you my very, very awesome application. This is me at my peak design level. I'm just kidding. It's garbage. But I've got a basic AngularJS application here. And if I navigate to the queens route, I'm going to see a list of queens. And so this is the code that is being, where did my, oh, sorry. I'm like losing tab-palooza here. Okay, so this is the code that is being created by this for loop. So I've created a subscription to my displayed queens with this async pipe, and so it's displaying, I keep doing it. All right, so it's displaying my list of queens. So, very common scenario, I have this huge list of all the queens who've ever been on Drag Race. Maybe I want to do some filtering. Maybe I am like, I really like season 6. I can't remember what queens are in there. So I might have some sort of drop down. Again, very attractive UI. And I want to filter and show only queens that were listed in season 6. Okay, pretty common functionality. This is where RxJS becomes really, really powerful. Shh. This is where drama. We're not even drunk yet. Okay, so this is where RxJS can become really powerful because we can deal with not only a stream of data that we've gotten from the server, but we can deal with inputs from a user and use those to combine to get the kind of the display in the UI that we want. So here we have, boom, boom, boom. So I navigate through my slides. Okay, here I have a behavior subject of selected season. So anytime that input changes, it's going to emit whatever that season value is. And then here I still have my displayed queen observable. So when we talk about deriving code, here's what's going on. Is I have this main member on my class, which is my displayed queen. This is what I care about at the end of the day. I care about what I'm showing to the user. So here what I can do is basically take that selected season, and so that's an observable that I know will be changing, and then I can pipe into it and basically get whatever value is from that season changing, and then I can return some information based on that. So if there's a season ID, I can go ahead and make a call to my queen service with that season ID to get only queens from that season, or I can just return a list of all my queens. And this is a little bit of type coercion. Sometimes TypeScript compilers get confused and it doesn't know what you're trying to do. So in this case, I'm saying, hey, TypeScript, I'm just going to let you know, I'm going to return you an observable that is going to be an array of queens. And so we can begin to take all these different values together, and we still have one source of truth. We just have that displayed queen, but we can pipe all these different things together, combine all these different inputs and data streams, and have one output from it. All right. I got a couple minutes left. So if you haven't heard, the Angular team has given us something called Angular Elements. And so Angular Elements are just wrapped up web components. Is anybody familiar with web components? Okay. JavaScript's so fun, like build it up, burn it down again. And we're going back to basics, you know, building framework agnostic stuff. It's good times. Like they're going to reinvent jQuery any day now. We're going to be plug and palooza again. But web components are a way to build framework agnostic reusable components. And so if you're considering upgrading your application, you don't want to keep writing a bunch of new features in an old language when you know you'll be updating. So using Angular Elements is a way that you can approach that. Built on the Web Components API. So the things we care about, custom elements, that lets you define that HTML tag that you can use anywhere. Templates, which are going to allow you to dynamically create markup, that will be inserted dynamically into the DOM when you need it. Shadow DOM, which provides us encapsulation for those web components and controlling scope, and creating custom events that you can trigger for your DOM interaction. If you're interested in web components or don't know anything about them, I've got, my company does a web components training. That's a link to the tutorial online if you're interested in going through that. So yeah, Angular elements are just Angular components packaged as custom elements. A bunch of great reading and resources here for people who are either working with Angular elements or using this approach to migrate applications. And then a good kind of intro talk from ngConf last year by Rob Orwell. So if you're walking away and you're like, all right, I feel like I can implement some of this. This might be a really good application for us. Here's what you should not do. You should not run back to work and refactor your app over the weekend without the consent of your team. If you do it, I will fine you and I'll drop kick your laptop out a window or something. Do not do that. What you do need to do is think about, beginning to refactor your app to follow this AngularJS style guide. Choosing a build process that makes sense for your team. Just because I talked about me liking Webpack does not mean you need to go and rewrite your entire build process. Figure out what makes sense for your team. Start rewriting your major files into TypeScript. You can do this piece by piece. Not everything has to happen at once. Implement RxJS where it makes sense. And then consider if building some new features in Angular elements would be an appropriate approach. And again, do nothing without buy-in from your team. Do not be that coding cowboy. You will make everybody miserable even if the code ends up better eventually. If you have any questions, I will be floating around. I think I'm about out of time, but this is the slide that you can take a photo of if you need links to my slides, links to the example application, or if you'd like the VS Code theme I'm using. I always get questions about it, but I didn't even show it, so.
Do you have the API?
Wait, what API?
You said that you were using an API. Why the bookmark?
Wait, what?
What's your question?
API.
The drag race API?
Yeah, I don't know. You can literally, I never remember what it is. Drag race API. Yeah, okay, just drag race API. I was like, I use a lot of APIs.
No shade.
I could probably take one more question and then we're gonna go to a break. So if you have any others, just go find Jennifer like she said. Okay, cool. All right, thank you, Jennifer.
Have a lovely day, you wonderful humans.